We're going to be exploring how we can use the HTML service, create template from file, creating templates from HTML content, and then also how we can bring in those files using a function within the Google Apps Script. So this way we can, when we do want the JavaScript or the style sheet, we can use an include and pull that content within our HTML code, our front-end client-side code. Also going to be showing you how you can pass in object data within the HTML template and then use that object information where you can have conditions or you can straight output the content either as HTML code with the exclamation mark or just as the regular value that's contained within the variable and output that to the page as well. Also how you can create custom functions such as this one where we've got called adder. So it requires one parameter, and this is going to be the row number of the content that we want to get from the sheet data and return that content back into our Google script. So we've selected that we want to get back the value from adder 1, which is corresponding with the row number 2 within the web page. So actually the row number 1 would be the content row that we're returning back. So if we update this, if we want to get the contents of row number 2, so what color is grass, and the first column, that will update that string value and output that to the page. So here we've got the what color is grass, so we're dynamically able to change and make different requests returning back content within the Google Apps Script. And then there's also going to be how you can use the scriptlets and run Google Apps Script code in the client side, even having conditions, setting up connections to the Google spreadsheet, returning the content from the Google spreadsheet, and then applying that content and outputting it on the page. So that's where we're building the list here at the top, and this is coming from the data that we've got within the spreadsheet. So all of this is coming up in this lesson. Let's create the function for doGet to output the request content onto the page and return back. And we're going to use the HTML service to render out the content that we're returning back. And let's create the HTML output that we want to output back and create a variable to hold the HTML output. So within the HTML output, this can be a string value that can render out some content that we want returned back. And within an HTML format, we have an option to return back different content. So let's try that out within the WebApp version. And when we refresh it, so we get the content being returned that we've constructed within the web app. And I'll give you a few other examples of how we can use it. So I'm going to toggle out the comment and create a second function. And again, the doGet is necessary for the web app to run. You don't have to, unless you're actually using the event object, then you don't have to pass that in. But this is also something that you can use as you're outputting content. So it's not a required value that needs to be output there. So let's try another value here using the HTML service. And we've got a few options here. So we can create HTML output from file. And that's going to be getting content from a file. And we already do have a file here called index. So we can reference that file as index and simply return back that file content. And we saw in the previous lesson that we can apply style, we can apply some JavaScript code, and that's all going to run within the web page. And typically when you are designing web pages, you might not want to include the style and the JavaScript code within the same file. So there is a trick that you can use, and with the Apps Script, you're only allowed to create HTML files. So we can set this up as a style sheet as long as we're using the style tags. So essentially it's going to be regular HTML code that we're bringing in. And I'll give you an example of that. So for instance, if we had one called main, and this is just going to be the main content, we want to output these elements into main. So let's save and save main. So those are saved separately. So what we want to do is we want to include the content from the other HTML file into this one. And the way that we can do that is using the Google Apps Script Scriptlet and evaluating the scriptlet content and equaling to the output. So we can run a function from the Google Script side and output that content into the page. So let's set up a function, just call it include. And for now, it's going to include the file called main and then render that code out onto the page. So go ahead and we'll save that. And then within the Google Apps script, we want to run that function. So this function called include is going to be the one that's going to get the content from the HTML. So we need to have one parameter, and that's going to be the file name that's being passed in as an argument into the include function. And remember, this is sitting on the Google script side. And we want to return using the HTML service, creating HTML output from a file, and whatever the file name is that was specified within the arguments, and get the content from this HTML file. So instead of outputting it from file, we want to just get the content from the file and then return that content. So let's see how this works now when we refresh the page, and we've got this include main. So let's go back to include, and it's actually not including the code. And because we can't use the createHTMLOutput from file, we need to create template from file. And because we're not just using HTML output, we're actually running some code. So this is where the template from file needs to be used. So when we update that to template from file, and we're still over here when we're using the include, we're still using the createHTMLOutput from file, but here we need to use the template because we're running a scriptlet. And in order to run the scriptlets, you need to use the templated format. Otherwise, you're just going to get the regular output as a string value. Let's also double check to see where it looks like we're throwing an error in the script. And that's because we need to do one more thing. And the reason when you get this error being thrown is that it's not evaluated that content. And when you're using template, if you do have a script in there, then you need to run the evaluation of that content. So if we were to remove out the script content and refresh it, we're still going to get that return not being valid. So let's go back into here, add in the scriptlet, and then here, when we're creating the HTML output, we want to run the evaluate method. So the evaluate allows us to execute the scriptlets and convert the template into an HTML output, and that's the object that we can use within the server. So let's try it now with the evaluate and refresh. Just save the code and refresh it. So now we're able to render out that HTML, and also notice that the JavaScript didn't break because this HTML content is now just as it would be if it was being written on the page, and we're just simply being able to output it on the page itself. So that allows us to essentially separate out the style content into a separate HTML file. So it's a little bit easier to read. And again, this is just going to be regular HTML, and if we only just want the style tags, we don't need to include the rest of the HTML. We can also indent this properly. And that's going to separate out the style file. And then within the main file that we're outputting within our main HTML file, we just need to reference the file that we want to include. So in this case, we want to include the style, and then also we want to include the JavaScript. So set up a separate file. I'll just call it JS. And actually that should be JS HTML. JS. And within the JS file, this is where we can hold all of the JavaScript code. So just as you would if you were developing a website or a web application, you can separate out the code and then include it into your main index file. So it makes it more readable. That we've got the style, the main, the include. Let's try the page out, just make sure it's still working the same as before. And also with the JavaScript code, so if you wanted to have a function, and let's say we want to add some content into there, and we don't need to necessarily send in a parameter or a value. We could send in a row value. And if we want to get the contents from a spreadsheet and add it in, so let's get the data using the SpreadsheetApp.openById, and we'll specify we'll get the ID afterwards, and then get sheet. We want to get the sheet by name. So getting the sheet, and I believe the contents of the sheet are in quiz 1, maybe. I'll get the quiz. So get different contents from the sheet. And these are all expecting string values. So we want to get the contents of quiz. Let's select the sheet index value, the ID value for the sheet itself. Set the ID. So we're getting the sheet by name, and then get data range. So that's going to get all of the content. And then let's get the values. So it's going to return it back within an array. And we want to actually return here. So creating output content in a, let's do it within a stringified format. So using JSON stringify, and then the content that we want to return back. So this is going to be coming from data and using the value of row to return that content. So now if we want, we can bring this into our HTML file using the include and the include method. So include, and the include is going to be including adder, and then the second parameter is going to be the row that we want to include. So adder, or we can just simply do the adder value. So see how that works, and it's expecting a value here. So let's include row from number 3 and refresh, and that gives us the value from row number 3. And we could update this if we want as well. So row number 1. So that's going to output the value from row number 1. If we don't want it as an array, so we can update that within the code. So update it like that, and that will remove out the array part of it. So I'll just return back the whatever the first column value is by the default. So it's just returning back that first column. So if we want to specify a column, we can do that as well. And I'll give you some more examples of how this works. So if, for instance, we wanted to just include some HTML as an HTML object. So we've got some HTML that we want to include into the HTML service. We can pull out the HTML and get that as an object. And then within HTML, we can evaluate the HTML content and then return HTML. So breaking apart the object, it's still going to work the same, but this is going to give us an opportunity. And actually it should be the HTML evaluate, because we need to run the evaluate when we're returning the object. Otherwise, we're going to throw an error. So now with the HTML, we can add in some data object. So within the HTML object, let's pass through some data, and we'll pass it in as an object value. So if we have a variable called output, and this is what we want to output, so we want to output a string value of HTML content, or if we want to just output a regular string. Now this is being passed in as a data object that we can then use within the Google Apps script. So just as we did over here, we can break into the scriptlets and get those values out. So if we want to get the value of data and just output the value of data, see what gets returned back. So this is referring to the content that we're passing in here within the HTML data object. And when we refresh it, we're getting it as an object format. So we can use the JSON stringify here to stringify that data object, just as we would within the Google Apps script. So you can run all of the same functions and methods as you do within the script. So that's going to stringify that content. If we want to output that content, say for instance we want data and selecting what we have for data. So we have output and we have string. So output and then data string. With the equal sign, you can output the values. Let's refresh. So here we're outputting the HTML. And actually we should have a line break for these so that we can distinguish between them. So refresh. So there's our line breaks. So that's the first output, the stringified version of the data object. The next is a div that's being output, and it's not rendering out as HTML code. And here it's outputting it. So that's outputting both as strings. So the difference here is, and this is why we use the exclamation mark, if we do have HTML code that we want to output, then we need to specify that. So if we did a style, and here we did background color blue, and save that, and we want to render it out actually as HTML instead of a string value, we need to use the exclamation mark. So that will force the scriptlet to use the syntax and avoid escaping the syntax content. So here it's using it just as a regular string. So if we want to render out that content and force it as HTML code without escaping it by default, we can do it that way, and that will render out the content as specified there. And that allows us to use this as regular HTML. So essentially forcing the scriptlet to run the code. You can also apply logic within the application. So we can check to see if a value, so let's set one more item here within the object, and val, so let's do that as a val of 10. And then within the output of the HTML, we're check to see if the value of data val is larger than 5, then we'll output some content. And here it will just write within the regular have a div. So we can break in and out of the scriptlet code. And so going back into the scriptlet code, as this bracket is part of that condition, else, and once again breaking into the code, and then let's finalize the condition. So it was smaller than 5. So now we can render it, and we see it was larger than 5. And actually let me add in the line breaks and update the value to be 1 and render out. So we were able to apply the conditions using the scriptlets and break in and out of the Google Apps Script directly within the HTML file. And although this is sometimes a little bit harder to read, so usually my preference is to do the calculations not in HTML but within the Google Apps Script, as it does become a little bit harder to read the content. But of course, by all means, you are able to do everything that you're able to do in the Google Apps Script. You're able to do that within the HTML side of it. So if we, for instance, we want to get the content from the spreadsheet and output that content, so creating a variable called output, and we can use the spreadsheet app and then open by ID. We need to specify the ID here. So it does get a little bit longer. So set the ID and then open by ID. So specifying the ID object. Then we want to get the active or get the get sheet by name. So all these methods quite long. I believe we've got the sheet name here as data1. So let's pass that in. So data1, so it's getting the sheet by name of data1, and get data range. And you can use also the spacing and the white space in order to make it more readable. So get values. And then now if I want to use that, I can output the content. So using the output and then for each item row, and let's output the content onto the screen. And I'll break in and out of the Google Apps Script, so that way we can set each one up under a separate. So let's set it up as an unordered list, and then within the HTML we'll set them up as list items, and then equal the contents of the row, then break back out and close off the list item. And then lastly, let's close off the unordered list. So quite a bit harder to read if we're outputting the contents this way. So let's see what happens. And output was already declared, so I think we need to reuse that. And output, save that. And so you do have conflicts here because we're using the output within the JavaScript. So you run into some errors there. But it is able to work, and we're able to select all of the content and render it out, although this way is quite a bit harder to read that content. So also for debugging, if you go to your Google script, you can set up a function, and I'll call it find bugs. So within the logger log, we can use the HTML service, create template from file, and then specifying that we want the content from index. And we simply want to just get the code. So that way it gives us a way to find the bugs to do some debugging, run the code. And that gives us the function. And notice that this is done within the JavaScript, where we've got the function, and then also that content from the Google Apps Script is also loaded into the function. And that's why we did throw that issue before, where we've got the output object that was being used because we've already created it within the template. And that's going to be run within a JavaScript function that's running all of this code that's being output. And so this way you can do some debugging of your code as needed. So go ahead, try it out, and try out different ways to work with the create template from file using the HTML service within Google Apps Script.